So while I had a long drawn out introduction for this video, I figured why bother when I can just let the subject of this video do all of the talking, because I am redesigning the Vahki for 2004 because the Vahki play a pretty integral role in my story. For one thing, they actually come out before the Toa Metru. They come out in the winter wave of 2004 in January. So the Toa Metru in my story will be coming out later in the year. But that means the proximity of the Vahki's timeline being so close to the Rakshi, it's really going to highlight the similarities between those two sets, and I needed to make them even more different. But I also wanted to make them more different because while the Toa Metru felt like an evolution on what came before, the Vahki kind of felt like a step backwards. So why take a step backwards at all? I wanted to change a few things, and there's a really novel function in here as well. So if you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe. It helps out the channel. And without further ado, let's go ahead and focus on this build. First things first, you will note that this build right here is kit bashed. It was designed in part designer. So just note that this mask design that you see in Studio itself is not the correct design. Although I don't think it looks bad, but the design that's directly above me is much closer to the final design that I want. And you will note that there's a disc in the back of the head. That disc is actually functioning as the eye stalk. We'll talk about why that is the case, why I chose that, and why it's important later on in the video. But for now, our main focus is not that mask. It's actually the function, because the function here feels to me like the logical evolution of everything that came before. When Bionicle debuted in 2001, the Toa Metru had a function, and it was a fun function. I guess that's a pun, right? But it is worth noting that that function is one that can get pretty old pretty quick. The Rakshi function was new and unique and novel, but if you're just going to reuse it again and again and again, it kind of wears out its welcome. So why not have a combination of both functions? There is a gearbox inside of essentially a Rakshi function. And what this ends up doing, this is all reliant on basically two pieces, but realistically three. I did redesign the Rakshi torso to make a new version that facilitates this and highlights some changes. We'll talk about that here in a moment. But when this gear on the back, this gear knob is rotated, it rotates the assembly on the inside of the model as well. But you'll note that there are also some gears in that assembly that are freely rotating. This neck piece, however, also has a gear grafted onto it that does not rotate at all. It is a stationary gear. And because of that, it means that when the beveled gears attached to the arms rotate along with the gearbox itself, they will move. Meaning that if you have the Rakshi function, which goes side to side, you have the Toa Metru function, which goes up and down. This is a combination of both functions. It's really simple, and it can be done with fairly few pieces. It is worth noting that of the Vahki, one of these pieces was brand new to those sets for that year, notably this sort of cap piece, right? It locks the arms in place, and it helps to sort of fix in the gear itself, the gear torso itself, right? So we can replace that mold because it's already a new mold anyway, but why not replace the others as well? Notably, this torso here would be a brand new mold, as well would be this body here, right? But it is also worth noting too that this body design, by being a change to the Rakshi design that came out before it actually affords the ability, even though it is taller than the original Vahki torso, just a little bit, to allow the Vahki build to be shorter than the final version of the model, which is this version right here. And I really quite enjoy that because it means that as simple as this is, the Vahki end up coming out just a little bit shorter than the official release. One reason why I like this is because the Rakshi are fairly tall builds. They're about as tall, if not just a little bit taller, than the Toa Nuva, and the Vahki are actually pretty similar in height. Even though their legs are shorter, their overall torso plus their head having this giant eye stalk on it ends up making them about the same height at the end of the day. So if we can do something to mitigate some of that height, to make it a little bit shorter, it's going to further change the silhouette from the Rakshi design and the Vahki design, further differentiating the two builds, which I like because it means that if this comes out in 2004 like this, it kind of feels like the Borak Kal thing all over again, where you've got this thing where Lego just releases the same set twice. Obviously, there are differences between the Vahki and the Rakshi, of course, but in some ways, this feels like a step backwards. However, by having it built like this, being shorter, it's going to further differentiate the sets, as mentioned before. But even more than that, if we have it so that the sockets are oriented in such a way so that they can also be moved facing upward, right? You can literally take them out of the gearbox, put them back in, you could actually afford the ability to have them transform as you do the official sets. Now, the official set transformation is not it's not the thing that I really enjoy, because while it is heavily promoted in the promotional material and advertisements and things in 2004, it ultimately ends up looking really clunky. The sets are kind of tall. They look just weirdly proportioned, weirdly postured, and I don't really care for it. One of the things that I do to mitigate this, though, is bring the build further down to the ground. Part of this is accomplished by actually changing the size of that torso, right? Making it a bit shorter, but also reorienting slightly where things connect on the torso as well. So ultimately, it ends up bringing the model a little bit closer to the ground and thus making it feel like, at least to me, this model is more dynamic when it's in its crawling pose. It feels faster. It feels more agile. And that's one of the other things I see about this version of the set as well. Because it's smaller, you might look at it and say, well, if it's that small, and then you've got the Toa Metru, aren't the Toa Metru just going to mow over these guys? They're so small. And I don't think so, for a couple of reasons. First off, these were introduced in the first half of the year. The characters they're going up against directly are actually the Metru Matoran, not the Toa Metru. Yes, you still get Lecon in the first half of my year. In fact, specifically, if you want to know how I separate the sets, in the first half of the year, you get the Vahki, the Metru Matoran, Toa Lecon and Kikanalo, and you get the Kreka set specifically, because they all play a role in the first half of my Bionicle story for 2004. In the second half of the year, you get the mutated Nadiki Titan character. His Toa form is alluded to in the story, but you don't get him as a set, as a Toa yet. Well, hold on. We'll talk about that here towards the end of the video. Also, you get Duma and Nivok, you get the Toa Metru, and then you get the disc packs, and we'll talk about those more towards the end of the video as well. Let's go ahead and talk about that head build before we get into any of that further information. Now, the Vahki head is the iconic thing about these builds, right? However, the problem that I have with it ultimately is that the eye stalk on them is made of this soft plastic, polypropylene plastic. And while it's perfectly fine as a plastic, it holds details very well, it's also prone to damage quite easily. And I don't know anybody that really separates these pieces from the rest of their collection, meaning if you throw this into a box, it can get scratched up very easily, not only by the parts, but by dust and debris that could be picked up along the way, right? And so, if we can change that piece, I think it's important to do so. However, it's a striking piece on the Vahki. On the Vahki, it is bright. It helps to really bring out their color scheme, because otherwise they're very muted as characters. But to have the eye stalk be a bright piece, I think we can still incorporate that. And it is worth noting that the original Vahki head is the mandibles, the head, the eye stalk, the disc, and then a couple of Technic connectors, right? So what if we can go about changing that so that now we do have one extra piece here. Notably, specifically, the original Vahki have 32 pieces. My Vahki, including having wrist sockets as well, has 33. So it's one more piece. But also on top of that, it is worth noting too that in terms of new molds, the Vahki includes 7 brand new molds introduced in their wave. 8 if you want to include the double socket, which, if we're talking about the first half of 2004, is a new piece. My version, including the double socket, goes up from 8 to 10. So it is 2 more molds that includes that helmet piece, right? And it includes that torso piece as well, that body specifically. But that's not to say that you have to use that body. You could still use the Rakshi body in here. I designed that torso gearbox to work with both. But of course, that is going to mean that the character will be a little bit taller again. Is that a big deal? No, not necessarily. But it again does bring some parallels between them and between the Rakshi from the year before. So it's just a little thing, but it is a thing that I would personally change if it were up to me. However, checking out that design for the head, and more specifically, the design up here, because that's a lot more accurate to the final design that I would come up with. The reason that that design is important to me is you'll note that the eye stalk in this is the disc. I think this is such a simple yet smart thing to do. For one thing, these discs are the collectibles of 2004, but also they're hard plastic, right? They are ABS or polycarbonate. And because of that, they're not prone to damage. Also, just generally their size makes them a lot easier to store elsewhere. And it makes them easier to sort of pack away, if you will, right? So you might store these separately from your Bionicle parts. You may store them separately from discs, and you could continue to do so in 2004 if these are the collectibles. My Metru Matoran also include discs, specifically the discs they have. In fact, very little changes about my Metru Matoran, with the exception of a single function that's added in, but that's a separate video. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Don't worry about it too much here. And they would have great discs, right? The Vahki, in this case, have unprinted, we'll talk about why in a moment, fluorescent discs. And I choose fluorescent transparent colors because when they capture sunlight or UV light, black light, whatever, they glow. Meaning not only does the eye stalk glow, but also the eyes, because it is worth noting that these discs are visible through the eye holes of these builds, right? So that I think is really important. And it's also worth noting too that the discs are pretty thin plastic. So even if you have a material that's very dark, like trans dark red like this, light still shines through this very easily. So you can take advantage of that. One of the issues I have with the Toa Metru eye stalk is the light piping is pretty terrible. So when you've got colors like trans red or trans dark blue, etc. in there, it's very hard to see those colors through to the Metru characters, right? But if here we're using fluorescent colors, we're using this thin plastic, these eyes are really going to pop, I think. Furthermore, because it is disk storage, if you wanted in the original Vahki sets to display the mandibles, you have to remove the disk, right? And that's fair, but it means that the disk is now a separate piece that could become lost. But if you use the eye stalk piece as a disk holder, literally disk storage, you now have a place to store the disk on the character while the mandibles are being revealed instead of the disk in the launcher. You could do both. And because they're robots in the story, right? Removing the disk from the back of the head, to me, doesn't even have to mean that they're like dead or anything like that, right? You could see it as them being depowered or whatever, or maybe they're sacrificing the power they do have. Maybe that disk is like a charge indicator, right? Like maybe they have to recharge a new disk before they can then load it in their mandibles. Like that's an interesting idea. And it is an idea that I've floated around as well. But even further than that, in the second half of my year, right? As I mentioned, you get the Toa Metru, you get the Nivalken and Duma, you get Nadiki, but you also get the disc packs. My disc packs likely would come with 3 discs and a disc launcher in a Metru color. And what those 3 discs would be, rather than great discs, I should mention, all of the Metru Matoran come with a great disc. Kreka comes with all 6 great discs. So if you collect all 6 of these guys and Kreka, you already have 2 complete sets of great discs right there. So my disc packs with 3 discs in them come with 1 Toa Metru disc of the 6, right? So all 6 Toa Metru get a disc in their color, but transparent with their mask on it. Vakama also comes with 1 of these, but it doesn't have his mask. It has Leekon's mask because he gets that disc from Leekon in the story for his weapon, right? The other Toa Metru discs, including this one with Vakama's mask, come out of the disc packs, but also the Vahki discs with their fluorescent color, and this time with an elemental print, also come in the disc packs, because later in the story, my Vahki gain elemental powers. And when they do, that is shown in the story by that disc in their head going from being blank to getting this elemental print on it. Furthermore, as you can see up here, that fluorescent disc is not just acting as the eyes. You'll note that on the top of the head, in my design up here, is the sort of Colosseum towers, right? And this is something that was heavily used in the Bionicle 2004 marketing, right? But it's not something that I think at least played a massive role in the story itself. Like from the Toa's perspective, did they ever see that skyline? Do they ever see? I don't know. But it's an interesting concept. And it's an important one because this right here is visual storytelling. Why? The Vahki appear in my story first, right? So does Toa Leekon, but none of the other Toa Metru. And so because of this, Leekon's first sort of role in the story is to do a little bit of detective work. Literally my first comic for 2004 is revolving around Leekon and this sort of like detective pseudo-noir retro future kind of story thing where Leekon's trying to kind of put together clues as to why the Matoran are disappearing. And by the end of that story, discovering that the Vahki have something to do with it, right? So having the Colosseum printed on that head like that, not printed, it's actually a detail. It is embossed in the head. And we'll talk about why that's important. But by having that on there, it gives a visual indicator where they're coming from, which you might look at and say, well, why would the person who creates the Vahki want you to know where they're coming from? But it's actually intentional. We'll talk about that in a minute. Anyway, in 2008 Bionicle, before we get into why that design is the way it is, Lego came out with this piece specifically, this color of it. And this is a neat one because it is dark blue, but it is a specific shade of dark blue that's very translucent. This is not an uncommon thing, but it's exceptionally common with this piece specifically. When you hold it up to light, which you're not going to be able to see on video, unfortunately, but you'll actually see that the light will shine through the thinner plastic areas, while the thicker plastic is left dark. The light can't penetrate it as easily, which means the thick details stand out. That is something I'm taking advantage of with these Vahki helmet pieces. The masks, if you want to call them that, on the Vahki are polypropylene in a similar way to the Toa Metru masks. And the area, the negative space around the Colosseum towers on the head is very thin, translucent plastic. But then the towers themselves are thick plastic. So when those eyes fluoresce, when they capture sunlight, or you hold a flashlight behind them, or you put UV light or black light or whatever behind them, not only do they fluoresce and light up the eyes really vividly, but faintly, the area around the Colosseum also glows. And I love this idea. Even without a disc in the head, right? The light will still penetrate that too. So it'll still light up. Like, I love this idea because, like I said, it's visual storytelling. And it's just a neat detail because now you've got this thing that appears in marketing material also appearing in one of your sets, which really brings you to say, oh, what is that? What is that place, right? Not only do you have a mystery to solve, and LeakCon has a mystery to solve, but those mysteries are related. And it also means that the first half of the year isn't kind of a slog because the Toa Metru are fighting this plant thing. Like, to me, as a plant guy, I should love that. But like, it was very boring and it just felt like empty. This is a time where they could be exploring the island, but it doesn't feel like that's what they're doing, right? They're just chasing down this thing and finding these great discs. And I don't think that that's unimportant necessarily. The Toa in my story, the Toa Metru, have a great disc hunting story arc, but it's mostly contained to one comic rather than multiple. In the books, it could be spread out, right? This is where you're meeting different Matoran characters, getting an idea that like one of the Matoran is potentially betraying them as a traitor or whatever, right? But in the comics, there's 6 comics in 2004, at least in my rewrite there is, right? Just one of those centers around the discs because of their importance in the story, specifically in the latter half of the year. So, in the first half of the year, what is the conflict? Specifically, it is the Vahki fighting against the Metru Matoran and LeakCon, right? And in the story, Nadiki as well, right? But Nadiki doesn't show up in the first half of the year because this is where the whole thing really just, I love this part. Okay. My Titan Nadiki build, the mutated Nadiki, that I came up with relatively recently. I have to revise it, and I already knew I did because the transformation function of Nadiki, I forgot to include it in my revamp, and that's not great. But something I did include in my Nadiki build was the Toa Metru body. And I thought this was a really fun little nod to the fact that Nadiki used to be a Toa Metru. But what if I'm already going to have the Toa Metru body in the set, and I'm already going to have the Metru hips in the set, because that's going to be where it pivots around to transform, right? And he's going to have limbs on his arms to connect his arms. Those could be Toa Metru limbs. And he's going to have the Toa Metru chest cover, right? You can see we're getting closer and closer and closer to just including all of the parts that make up a Toa Metru. It's going to use the feet as armor. So, like, you see where I'm going with this, right? In my story, LeakCon is identical to his official release. My bad. He is dark red and black and flat gold. Nadiki, however, is dark green and black and silver. And the Nadiki Titan that I designed is dark green and black and silver. So all the parts can literally be included in the appropriate colors to turn him into, with the parts included in that box, a Nadiki Toa. Now, here's the other thing. My thought is, I don't know anybody that's going to want to build either Nadiki the Titan or Nadiki the Toa. But I do know people that would want to build either Nadiki the Titan or Ultimate Duma. And I do plan on revamping Ultimate Duma with my builds. So, when you build Ultimate Duma, what if we leave behind the pieces to then build Toa Nadiki? So now, when Ultimate Duma is built, it can be this little mini story arc of Ultimate Duma versus Nadiki. Does it make sense in the story? Not especially, because Ultimate Duma or Makuta, whatever, doesn't really reveal himself until after Nadiki is mutated, but I don't care that much about the fact that both would appear in the same thing, because you can write that story. You can make that story make sense. Maybe this is something that's happening in Nadiki's mind, right? After Nadiki gets kidnapped by Kreka and delivered to Duma, right? Maybe Duma, as Makuta, right, sort of flashes over Nadiki's mind, and they're taking this battle in sort of this liminal space that doesn't actually exist, where Makuta can reveal his true self, but he's not revealing his true self in the story because he can't break free of Duma's body. He doesn't have the power yet. That's part of why the Great Discs are important and the Toa Metru are important. That comes later, right? But this is an interesting little thing that we could have. It's so fun how all this stuff just kind of carves out a little hole in the story, and then something else just fits into it like a jigsaw puzzle. It's little things. And part of the reason why I rewrote so much of 2004 to begin with is because, to me, 2004 has a lot of these story arcs that feel very complicated and convoluted and feel like they waste time in some cases. That was the whole point of why. It was the catalyst to why I rewrote the 2004 story in the first place, is because I gave Makuta, or Duma, more agency, more control over the direct events that are taking place, and I show him as being a more cunning character because he's planning for specific things to happen, but he's also shaping up these contingency plans and doing these other things in the background in case his main plan doesn't work. This showcases that Makuta isn't this arrogant sort of brain dead character that's just, cliche evil villain character, but he's intelligent. He's not just willing to manipulate people like we see him do with Takua in the Mask of Light movie, or Nadiki in this sort of like pseudo liminal, hyper realist space, but also he's beyond breaking people, beyond breaking Duma, right? The original character that he took over, that he possessed. But he's also able to go out of his way to plan ahead, chess move style. I love these little moments just like this. It's so simple, and yet it makes perfect sense in the story, at least in my opinion. Anyway, outside of all of that, I'm sure there are plenty of things that I haven't mentioned in this video. I talked briefly about how my first comic for this Bionicle 2004, if you will be this sort of like Lee-Con detective story where he's trying to figure out, who exactly is to blame, who's responsible for the Matoran disappearing, how did these Vahki appear, and are the things related, right? Who's this shadow character that people keep speaking of, but faintly, Kreka, these silhouettes, these footprints that I find, but I never see them, right? And then to gather this information, to collect this evidence, to do this detective work, to find out, yeah, it is the Vahki. They have something to do with the Matoran disappearing, and to take that back to Toa Nadiki, only to find that Toa Nadiki has also disappeared in the time that Lee-Con was gone. And this is also important too, because in my story, Toa Lee-Con is not a Toa manga. I mean, you can call them that. They can have whatever name they want. In my story, I'm just working with the working title of Toa Sigil, but it could really be anything. And they're called that because they protect the sigil of Matanui, which is also a disc, that you could get from the disc packs, but it's very rare because it would replace one of the great discs that could appear in those disc packs. But these two Toa, Nadiki and Lee-Con, are protecting this sigil. And when Lee-Con goes out of his way to try and find what's going on, leaving Nadiki alone, this gives ample time for Kreka to take Nadiki, right? You might ask, well, couldn't he take the sigil too? I'm going to have a reason that he can't do that. It's not terribly important for the sake of this video, but ultimately, this is why Nadiki disappears. It's kind of a direct response to Lee-Con and his choices, in a way, right? Which is ultimately going to bring a little bit more life to the fact that that Lee-Con is going to choose to sacrifice his power, basically, to create 6 new Toa. It's not just that Lee-Con's going to give the Toa stones, right? But rather that Lee-Con's doing it because the Toa sigil, if you will, are ancient Toa. They've been around for a long time. Their life force, if you will, is nearing its end. And this is their final task, if you will, just protecting this sigil so they don't have to waste what's left of their Toa energy, if you will, right? But it comes at the cost of that energy to create this new team of Toa Metru. And these are novice characters. So Lee Khan will go from being a Toa to being a Turaga, right? He's not going to pick these Matoran characters because he was tricked to pick certain characters, but then the other guy was tricked to, because that's silly. Like I said, it just gives Makuta zero agency, it feels like to me. So instead, no, he's picking people that he has observed himself, that Lee Khan thinks, oh yeah, this person specifically is a good candidate for becoming a Toa. He doesn't know that they're going to succeed. In fact, they really don't succeed, right? Even in the original 2004 story, the Toa Metru kind of lose. It's one of the things that makes that story interesting, in my opinion. And they do lose in my story, at least to begin with. But he can't know that. He has to sort of take this bet that if I create these 6 new Toa, at the very least, we stand a chance. By myself, I cannot both defend the Sigil of Matanui and solve this problem with these Matoran disappearing. But as a Turaga, I could still protect the Sigil of Matanui, and then these 6 Toa could figure out, hey, what's going on? Or they could confront the Vahki, or they could find where these Vahki are coming from in the first place and deal with it there, to fight them at the source, you know? They could figure out more things to go on that are going on with Cricket, etc. So I like this idea because now not only are they new Toa that have to learn to work together and learn their skills, but now they have this mentor character in Lee Khan, who's now a Turaga. They have just all kinds of little things going on that tie the story together further. And I'm looking briefly aside because I should have my it's literally right in front of my face, my Turaga Lee Khan build too. And I don't know if I showcased this build in a previous video. Probably did, because I also use this build for my Turaga Duma before his corruption. But specifically, let's go full screen here. My Turaga Lee Khan, it's basically just the original Turaga Lee Khan build, but now it's using the Toa Metru foot, and in this case, specifically an armor piece, just to add a little bit of extra flat gold on there. But it's worth noting that my design of this, minus these pieces in black, which are bootlegs, by the way, don't worry too much about that, this is designed to be buildable in all 6 of the Toa Metru colors as well, because in the story, very briefly, the Toa Metru will also become some form like this. They will diminish as well. Briefly, because they will become Toa Metru a second time, but that's not terribly important. So, will they release as sets? No. Lee Khan probably will. Turaga Lee Khan would probably be a special edition set that comes out in the second half of the year, which would make sense. It would come out after Toa Lee Khan, of course. But also, it would give you the build that you yourself can then make from the Toa Metru, right? So that way, when the Toa Metru builds, which look just like this, but in their Turaga-ish form, or the diminished form, whatever you want to call it, show up in the comics, although you don't get the sets, you understand the parts that are available to build those yourself. And that's a fun thing. Okay, I think I'm done with this video. It's a long one. I apologize for that. Obviously unscripted, but if you do want to see more information on my Bionicle 2004 story, just note that I wrote out a simple premise for each of the 6 comics for 2004, specifically in the Discord, more specifically in the Lego and toy discussion channel. So you can check that out. Link for that in the description. It is free to join, of course. Also, if you do like these ideas, but you want to contribute your own ideas, you can do that over there, or you can tag them along down in the comments below. Tag, that's the wrong word to use. It's fine, whatever. Be sure to subscribe while you're there as well, and do join the conversation. Do you like the changes that I made to the Vahki? Do you like any of the changes that I alluded to in the story for Bionicle 2004? And if not, why? If so, why? What do you think I should change? What do you think could be different or better or improved? Introduced. Anyway, that's it for this one. I hope you enjoyed. Be sure to enjoy this weather. It's nice outside today.